Tonight on 360, Sean Combs acquitted of the very worst charges, convicted of the arrest and denied bail by a judge who cited the defense's own admissions of Combs' violence. The question now, could that foreshadow the sentence he'll get? Also tonight, the president's big bill stalls for hours as Republicans try to round up votes from within their own ranks. And later, a fire in California in a warehouse full of fireworks. The explosion that followed leveled the site and left 7 people unaccounted for. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. We begin with Sean Combs, who's no longer facing life in prison or anything close to it, but is still behind bars tonight. That's because even though jurors in his federal trial today acquitted him of racketeering and sex trafficking, they did convict on 2 counts in transportation to engage in prostitution. One involving his ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, and the other in connection with an accuser not named in court and others. And though bail is not unheard of in such cases, ahead of sentencing, this time the judge said no. In explaining why, he addressed defense attorney Mark Agnifilo, telling him, "You full-throatedly, in your closing argument, told the jury that there was violence here, and domestic violence is violence. And you said this is a case that did involve violence." Now, you'll remember the defense made a point from the very start of the trial, acknowledging their client's violent acts, most infamously this one against Cassie Ventura, caught on tape in 2016. And though it may not have factored in the verdict, it certainly did in today's bail denial, and going by the judge's words, certainly could factor into the sentencing. None of that stopped a celebration by Combs' supporters outside the courthouse, some of whom, according to CNN's Laura Coates, doused one another with baby oil, a reference to Combs' so-called freak-off sex parties. And some fans had T-shirts referring to both that and his racketeering acquittal, which read, "A freako is not a Rico." Inside court, no shortage of drama either. Afterwards, Combs' legal team sounded triumphant.
It's a great victory for Sean Combs. It's a great victory for the jury system. You saw that the Southern District of New York prosecutors came at him with all that they had. They're not stopping, but one thing stands between all of us and a prison, and that is a jury of 12 citizens. So today is a great day. Today is a win. Today is a victory of all victories for Sean Combs.
Big night in any event, with much more in the story still to come. CNN's Kara Scannell was in court literally with a front row seat as it unfolded. She joins us from outside the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. So what was it like when the verdict was read in court?
Anderson, when we learned that there was a verdict, Combs came out of the holding area where he is being detained and walked in, kind of gave his family a little prayer nod, which he's done repeatedly. But his lawyers had grave expressions on their faces. The jury had only deliberated for 13 hours in a trial where the testimony had spanned more than 6 weeks. Now, the judge said that they had reached a verdict. He brought the jurors in, and then the 4-person from the jury stood up and was asked how they found Combs. Count 1, the racketeering conspiracy. The 4-person said not guilty. At that point, Combs put his head in his hands. When the 4-person said for count 2, sex trafficking conspiracy involving Cassandra Ventura, he said not guilty. Combs had a slight fist pump and as he was sitting at the defense table. And then he was found guilty of this transportation for prostitution, 2 of those charges, but acquitted on the most serious charges. Now, in his friends and family who were sitting in the rows directly in front of me, at that first sound of not guilty, they shouted out yes, and then at the second not guilty, they said woo, and they made noises in the courtroom. Not enough to disturb it, but a complete release of the tension that they were clearly feeling. And after the jury foreman had said the verdict, he then polled the jurors to ensure that each and every one of the 12, the 8 men, the 4 women, this was their unanimous verdict. And at the time that they were doing that, Combs was nodding toward the jury. He had his hands again in a prayer position as though he was thanking each and every one of them. After the verdict was read, because Combs is still in detention, he was being escorted out of the courtroom. He stopped to pause to his family, and he said to them, "Thank you. I love you, love you, love you." And as he turned to walk out, they erupted into applause. So he left the courtroom with the sounds of applause. Then his lawyer spoke to the family members. They were hugging each other. They were patting each other on the back. It was pure joy in there. One of the attorneys was crying, and the spectator section, the friends and family, they started chanting dream team," at the attorneys who had just helped Sean Combs evade potentially a life sentence.
When the judge denied bail for him, what was his reaction?
So the judge came right on the bench after this long pause, and he out of the gate said that he was denying bail. Combs's eyes widened, his mouth opened. He looked like he was shocked because of the significant win he had earlier in the day. Now the judge was saying he was not going to be released before the sentencing. His lawyers still continue to try to make the argument, saying, that his young children needed parents, saying that this case was unlike other cases. But the judge denied it, saying that this was a case of violence, that there was violence that his own legal team admitted to. And at one point, Combs had waved his arms in the air as though he wanted to address the judge. And Agnifilo, his attorney, said, "Let me talk to my client," walked over to him, and then came back, and Combs did not address the judge. So clearly they did not want him to speak at that moment. But then when Combs was about again to leave and head back into the court, into the detention, he turned again to his family. They allowed him a moment. He leaned into them and he said, "We're going to make it through this. I'll see you when I get out. I love you all. Be strong."
All right, Kara, thanks very much. Joining us now here is former federal judge Shira Shenlin, criminal defense attorney Arthur Idal, and CNN anchor and chief legal analyst Laura Coates, who's been at the courthouse throughout this trial. Laura, the split verdict, what do you make of it?
You know what, I have to tell you that not just hindsight, but the way the presentation of evidence came in, I am not stunned that they were unable to make a full case with respect to RICO, a notoriously complex case that's usually associated with the mob, and also made the jurors actually consider a series of mini trials for each of the predicate acts, whether it's kidnapping or arson or bribery and the like. And that complexity, I think, played a role in it having a hung jury yesterday and today a resolution that I think shocked the fact you go from a hung jury to now an acquittal. But the most serious charges are now off the table, and what remains are including those prostitution-related charges. It's surprising for many, given the testimony, overwhelmingly emotional, at times extremely compelling, from not only Cassie Ventura, who was the recipient of that savage assault in that Intercontinental video, or Jane, a pseudonym person who described her own trauma, that the jury was unconvinced, even when the prosecution said you only need to find one instance of sex trafficking for either of these two victims to have this person convicted. And they were on the stand for days. We heard about years-long relationships. They weren't convinced for a single one.
Arthur, what do you think was the crucial part of this case for the defense?
Well, the cross-examination of Cassie and of Jane as they went, I mean, obviously those are pivotal parts, right? They have really all of the powerful evidence. That's Cassie in the video. I just spoke to her attorney, Doug Wigdor. As upset as they are about the verdict, we shouldn't forget that her civil case is kind of what led to this criminal case. So Wigdor bringing the civil case is what got the U.S. attorney excited to bring the criminal case. She did walk home with $30 million. But overall, Anderson, I think it was the technology, the emails and the text messaging, where they're consenting about these freak-offs. They're consenting to do these things. That's evidence that you can't cross-examine, and the government can't fix those texts and emails from the alleged victims saying that they want to be participants in these actions.
Judge, do you agree with that those texts were important?
I do, absolutely. I think consent was the big issue here. I think the jury was obviously troubled by that. And remember, in criminal cases, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And there certainly would have been a reasonable doubt on that consent issue.
And Laura, you talked about this before, but there were alleged co-conspirators who were not called. Do you think that impacted things?
Absolutely. It was one of the big questions, and it even came up during the closing arguments and the rebuttal piece, because it was kind of the big giant elephant in the room. They had named alleged co-conspirators, two people, one of whom was Christina Karam, who is the right-hand woman of Sean Combs, who has denied any wrongdoing, has not been charged with the crime. Similarly, D-Rock as well, the security guard. And they were one of the witnesses that were never called. In fact, the jury heard from those who had been called, who were also receiving immunity. It must have in their minds been wondering, why am I not hearing from these people? Of course, you can charge someone with conspiracy, even if it's just one defendant. Need not actually charge everyone in that indictment, but that's a huge one. And they tried to clean it up in the prosecution by saying, we didn't call them, but you know what? They were equally available to all of us, and they could have called them. Well, the government has the burden of proving Diddy's guilt. He does not have the burden of proving his own innocence at all.
Judge, were you surprised that bail was denied?
Sorry?
That bail was denied?
No, I'm not surprised that bail was denied, because the judge heard all of this evidence in this case. And the evidence showed a lot of bad acts. Whether the jury bought it or not is a different issue.
And the judge is allowed to take that into
Oh,
consideration.
sure. The judge heard about drugs. The judge heard about guns. The judge heard about a lot of arson. Thank you. The judge heard a lot of bad things. And the judge said, this is a violent person, and you're allowed to consider that because you talk about the safety of witnesses and the safety of the community when you decide bail issues. So there's two things you consider. Is this person going to return to court? Yeah, I think he would have. But is he dangerous out there? Maybe. Maybe he would have threatened these women.
And following up on that, Anderson, all of those same factors the judge is allowed to consider in sentencing.
Right.
So what I'm saying is, no one's going to disagree with Mark Agnifilo. Today's a great day for Sean Combs. He avoids life in prison. He avoids a mandatory minimum of 15 years. However, the judge, everything he heard at that trial, he's allowed to take it.
What's the maximum?
20 years. He could get
10 years for each count.
10 on each one to run consecutively.
So that's the point. To run consecutively, which is very, very rare. Mostly sentences on different counts run concurrently, which means if you give somebody 10 years, it's 10 years.
So 10 years would be probably the maximum.
Yeah,
probably.
I don't think.
Do you have a sense of what do you think is likely?
That's the $64,000 question.
Is it totally
as
up
they
to the
say.
judge?
Totally up to the judge. Absolutely. That judge will be thinking about this, I'm sure, right till the date of sentence.
But the guidelines come into play as well. I mean,
but he's not bound.
Right. He's a category. Right. That's an important point. He's a category 1, they say, in terms of no prior acts. But the judge has discretion entirely on this case.
Absolutely. There are something called federal sentencing guidelines. When I was there, they were mandatory. Then they became not mandatory. At that point, you can do whatever you want. You have full discretion.
So, Anderson, what happens is the prosecution is going to put together like a "This Is Your Life" Sean Combs, all the positive things. The defense is going to do that. The prosecution is going to make him sound like the worst guy ever walked the planet Earth. But then there's the Department of Probation, who's supposed to be objective, and they're going to give a recommendation to the judge based on other crimes or based on similar acts, even nationally, what people under those crimes would get sentenced to. But the judge is allowed to say, the way he did today, hey, Mr. Defense Attorney, you owned his violence in your summation, and therefore I'm not letting him out. And there's specific deterrence in the sentencing to make sure Combs doesn't do this again, but there's general deterrence where the judge is telling the world, if you commit these kinds of crimes, this is the punishment that you're going to get. And that's where I think Sean is going to get hurt.
So very interestingly, Agnifilo said, we'll waive the pre-sentence report from the probation department. We'll waive it. And the judge, not so fast. I'm sure he wants to hear their recommendation because that's the only neutral body.
And Laura, the defense wants to expedite the sentence
because they're hopeful that he'll be able to return home sooner to Star Island. I tell you, if I were the defense attorneys, I would be standing 10 toes down to talk about the fact that yes, the judge can consider all those different aspects of it, but the jury did not find compelling enough to actually convict on the elements of crime and violence, and so that's going to have to take into account here. Also, remember, and I know I'm not projecting, I'm not speculating here, I'm just reminding people. President Trump in his first term, he had a posthumous pardon on these similar counts in a very different context for Mr. Johnson, very different world. But you're talking about somebody who has potentially the prerogative to act on something, and he has done so before. And in this instance, you can believe that based on what the defense already believes is an overcharge of that RICO, that they're going to suggest somehow that this is, if they were to appeal that, which they could now, they're going to suggest, hold on a second, this was a pretextual basis. You overcharged us, strategically trying to make sure he was the worst person in the world before this judge and everyone else, and that's why there was a conviction even on these charges as well. Successful? Likely not, but they're going to have to do the advocacy continuously up and through sentencing. They're going to have a remote hearing in the next week where the judge will hear them on having an earlier sentencing date. But you best believe any time he serves right now, right, Your Honor, can be credited to what he might ultimately get.
Sure, he's already served 10 months, so to speak, on his sentence. It all counts.
So that would be included.
Oh, absolutely, it counts. Yeah.
How long do you think it would be before sentence? What's an expedited sentencing?
Well, right now it's October 3rd, but it would only be expedited if they waive that pre-sentence report. And I don't think the judge is going to go along with that. He wants to hear from them.
It's typically 4 months from the date of a conviction or a plea.
Why so long? I don't know.
Because the Department of Probation, I think, Judge, statutorily, the Department of Probation gets like 90 days, right? 90 days. So they get 3 months to put their little report together because it's pretty thorough. I mean, it's like 70 pages, 80 pages. No. It's not a lighthearted thing. In a case like today, they could go really deep on a case like this.
They will. In his, I mean, because one of the factors is recidivism, this fancy way of saying they might commit a crime again, and also remorse. Would you consider either of those things if Sean Diddy Combs did not demonstrate remorse for these particular charges as opposed to overall?
Not me. I would not, because there are a lot of reasons that the defendant isn't going to stand up and say, I'm sorry I did all this. There are a lot of reasons not to say that. Now, in his case, he has admitted through the lawyer to certain things, and he certainly can say he's sorry for that. But he has to be careful, because the case will be appealed, no question, and he will seek bail again pending appeal.
And there's civil cases out there. To the judge's point, there's civil cases, and this will hurt him to some degree, but anything he says will be used against him in the civil cases to get more money.
Wow. Judge Shinlin, thank you very much. Arthur Ardella as well. Laura
Always
Coates,
a pleasure.
very much. Don't miss a special edition of Laura Coates Live later, 11 p.m. Eastern, focused on the Combs verdict. On Saturday, new episode of The Whole Story. The case against Diddy airs 8 p.m. Eastern time here on CNN. Next for us tonight, Sean Combs' rise from rapper to music and fashion mogul and all the other stops on the tumultuous, sometimes violence-plagued road to this moment.
Sean Diddy Combs, the music mogul, will remain behind bars until his sentencing. That ruling from the judge came just moments ago, with the judge saying that he, quote, denied bail when it wasn't mandatory before the trial and see no reason to reach the opposite conclusion now, unquote. This after a jury earlier today found Combs not guilty on the 3 most serious charges against him, racketeering and 2 different counts of sex trafficking. The jury did convict Combs on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. CNN's Laura Coates is outside the courthouse in New York. So many twists and turns in this case, Laura. Explain the judge's reasoning for keeping Sean Diddy Combs behind bars after a jury has basically acquitted him of the most violent charges here.
Wow, what a whirlwind, Jake. After 7 weeks of trial, and the question now, based on those 2 guilty charges and convictions, what will the judge do? We thought there was a chance he might come out the front door. It is clear now that he will not, and that the judge has said, based on the defense attorney's own recitation and acceptance and acknowledgement of the violence towards Cassie Ventura and Jane, acceptance in the sense that they say that it happened, not that they approved of it, that they said that that weighed on his decision as to whether or not to release Sean Combs pending his ultimate sentencing that could be as late as October. Now, Agnifilo, who is the lead defense attorney in this case, went on to describe personality and character flaws of Sean Diddy Combs, but said, listen, he was a model inmate while he was in detention. He appeared every day in court. He faced the music. He was decent with the court and needed a chance. At one point, he even appealing to the judge by turning to the now convicted felon Sean Diddy Combs, saying that his daughters, at least 2 of them, do not have a parent, alluding to the fact that their mother, Kim Porter, had passed away tragically several years ago. She also was the mother to several other children of Sean Combs as well. And then you had Maureen Comey, who is the lead prosecutor from the SDNY, who, of course, is being evaluated by the public right now in terms of whether they should have brought these charges or not. She has believed in them wholeheartedly and was an exemplary advocate in that courtroom. However, she fell far short of what the SDNY hoped to get, a conviction in this matter, and the jury told them emphatically through their verdict no on many of those counts. But she said in that courtroom, advocating still, that they wanted to pursue incarceration for Sean Diddy Combs, and talked about him being a violent man with a violent temper, to which prompted Mark Agnifilo to talk about how Sean Combs entered a almost anger management and domestic violence related program, to which Jane herself helped him write the letter, that he was in the process of making himself a changed man and working on himself. And Agnifilo said, almost quipping at one point, well, I guess it's a good thing essentially that we have juries, not the prosecution in this matter. They will have a remote sentencing hearing next week where they will go over a possibly accelerated sentencing for Sean Diddy Combs. But as of right now, he's not walking out of that front door. He will be largely sentenced. What it will be, we do not know. It could be as late as October. And keep in mind, Jake, he's already presently in custody. So any time that he has served in jail up till now would be credited and applied to any sentence he might ultimately get, which could be up to 10 years for each charge that could run consecutively, because each charge was different in time and different people. But it also could be as low as 21 months.
So you're a former federal prosecutor. Our audience probably doesn't need that reminder, but just in case. Are you surprised by the judge's decision here?
Well, Sean Combs was. We're just learning from inside the courtroom that when the judge denied him bail, his mouth dropped, his eyes widened in disbelief. Well, one of the things that surprised a lot of people about his decision to deny bail was two things. Number one, the jury essentially rejected the violent accusations against him in terms of what they ultimately concluded. So the judge weighing that right now might be very shocking. The other part of this, of course, is that he had asked the parties when there was a verdict, and there was an immediate request by Mark Agnifilo to have Sean Diddy Combs immediately released with conditions that would be placed on him and then come back for sentencing. The judge asked this question. He said, is there any precedent or any example of somebody being held in custody until their sentencing for these specific charges? And remember, they are prostitution-related charges under the Mann Act, transportation to engage in prostitution, which, by the way, Jake, does not include force or fraud. It has to include essentially the person having a commercial act and what's going on. And so that, it seemed as though, would be an indication the judge was inclined. And there was a pretrial officer who was inside the courtroom at one point who, and their job, of course, is to create and establish and follow through on conditions of release that might be set for somebody who would be released. What could those include, Jake? They could include something like drug testing on a weekly or even daily basis. It could include no travel. It could include ankle bracelets. It could include a lot. But you know, right now, we've got our own Kara Scannell, who has been inside of the courtroom, Jake, watching every single thing unfold. And I am dying to know what happened in there, Kara. Sean Combs denied bail. He's not coming out of that front door. What happened?
So the judge got on the bench, denied bail right away, and I had a literal front row seat with a clear view of Combs. His eyes widened, his mouth open. He looked at his attorney. He appeared to be in shock. I think they were in there thinking he was going to walk out that door today. But the judge said that there were no exceptional circumstances here, that all the reasons that Combs' team had cited were personal reasons, to be there for his family, for his kids, and it didn't overcome the bar and the congressional mandate in the law that says for someone who is convicted of a crime under this statute, under this title, had a mandatory detention. Now, his lawyer had argued that there was no other prostitution case. He even referenced Elliot Spitzer, who was not charged with any wrongdoing, but that company that had the prostitutes was convicted of some crime. So he was saying that in that instance, where people had made money, those people were given bail, but the judge denied it after the prosecutors again argued, is what they said, that the only thing exceptional about Combs was his wealth, his violence, and his brazenness. And while the judge did hang on that violence, he said that Combs' team admitted that Combs was violent throughout this trial in the closing arguments. He even read back portions of this transcript to the parties, to Combs' lawyer, and he's saying that right now at this stage, not sentencing, but at this stage when it has to do with bail, the burden is on the defendant, and the defendant admitted he was violent, and so the judge couldn't get past that.
They went on to say, Agnifilo, he dated the violence and said this hasn't happened since X date, and referenced Jane, who testified in this trial as one of the main victims for whom the jury did not find sex trafficking to be persuasive for her, that she was one of the people who wrote a letter to help him get into a program to deal with his violence. And He was a man in progress. Describe that.
Right, that is the point that the defense was trying to make. I mean, they said that on this fight, this June 2024 fight, they said that Jane instigated it. She had testified she did start the fight, and that they were arguing that he was trying to get help, that they brought him to attend a program. They said at his sentencing, there will likely be someone from that program to talk about the man in progress, how he was trying to improve himself, and that is one of the reasons that they were arguing for this. But it was not enough to overcome what the judge said was their burden and his concern that there could be violence. He said the most dangerous violence is the violence that happens behind closed doors. That's domestic violence. That's what Combs admitted to. And so for this reason today, he said he wasn't going to let him out.
Kara, I have to know what happened, because we never heard from Combs testifying. They chose not to testify, a gamble that obviously paid off with the more serious charges. But he asked to speak to the judge in that courtroom. What happened? What did he say? Anything?
No, so he waved his hands as his lawyer was wrapping up. I mean, he had passed him, my count, 4 Post-it notes trying to get his lawyer's attention. His lawyer looked at the notes, but whatever he wrote on them, we don't know. But then Combs started waving his hand, and his lawyer said, Your Honor, he wants to talk to you, but let me talk to him first. So then Agnifilo went over to Combs. They talked. Then Agnifilo resumed the conversation. So he had made some decision that Combs was not going to address the judge today. After, though, the hearing and then when the judge left the bench, Agnifilo did turn to Combs' family members. Again, all of his kids there, his mother, his sister, and he was telling them, he said that, this is winning. Winning is winning. You live your life. You have a good life. He'll be back soon. And Combs himself spoke to them. He said, I'll see you when I get out. We're going to make it through this. He blew a kiss to them and he said, love you all.
Unbelievable to hear how this all unfolds. We were just talking a few hours ago, Jake, about the possibility of him walking out of the front door, and of course his family hearing and jubilation at some points in times, as Kara was describing so eloquently earlier today, what happened inside that courtroom when they were expressing and even woohooing and shouts, his own mother walking into a crowd of people who were congratulating her on her son's essential acquittal on some of these charges. But this is a really significant moment because it is an indication, Jake, that this judge intends to likely incarcerate Sean Combs. Again, it could be applied from what he's already doing right now, but now we know it's a waiting game. How much time will he actually get and in what form?
All right, Laura Coates and Kara Scannell outside the courthouse in Manhattan. Thanks so much. Let's talk about this with trial attorney Misty Maris and criminal defense attorney Bill Brennan. Misty, first to you. Are you surprised at all that the judge denied bail?
So the defense had a good argument, and Jake, I thought they might be successful, but the legal standard is that the burden is on the defense to show by clear and convincing evidence. Clear and convincing evidence is a little less than reasonable doubt, a little more than a civil case, but it's a high standard. That there are exceptional circumstances as to why the default rule, which is that someone who's convicted spends the time in jail through sentencing, should not be the case. So that legal standard makes it really difficult for a defendant. Another piece of this, when we heard the commentary from the judge, what might surprise defendants in federal court is that judges are allowed to take into consideration relevant conduct. So even though there was an acquittal, the judge can still consider some of the testimony, evidence, circumstances, and admissions by the defense. And so that's what we saw here, ultimately resulting in Combs behind bars until that sentencing hearing.
Bill Brennan, earlier today, the defense wrote the judge asking for Combs to be released on bond. They argued he's not a flight risk because Combs faces a lighter sentence. Quote, expected guidelines range of 21 to 27 months. Mr. Combs has already been incarcerated for 10 months, unquote. Do you think Combs is going to spend any more significant time in prison?
I think the issue is significant, Jake. The guidelines are about as thick as the Manhattan phone book. There's an awful lot of voodoo that both sides can play with that. But if you were looking at a heartland, I think that 21 to 27 is where you probably start. The government will come in and say, we want enhancements. They may say vulnerable victim. They may say amount of victims. They may say coercion. They may say duress. The defense will come in and say, under the First Step Act passed during the first Trump administration, a lot of favorable amendments were enacted for defendants, including the enactment of what's called a true zero. And it seems that Mr. Combs has no record, I read. So if he's a true zero, he'll get a couple points off for that. So where it lands is anybody's game. But I think that 21 to 27 is a fair, educated guess. I don't know how much time he has in, probably a year. I don't know when he went in, but like every day he's in, he gets credit. Yeah. So it's not the end of the world that they didn't let him out. And on Misty's point on that 1B1.3 relevant conduct, the feds had all the face cards until last year. You could try a drug case with 20 counts. You could beat 19 of them. And that, or you could, you can't imagine that this was a law, but you could beat 19 of them, and you think you're going to sentencing on one count. They could bring in under this relevant conduct all those charges you were acquitted on. Last year, the guidelines were amended to say when relevant conduct is attempted to be brought in by the government, they cannot bring in charges that he was acquitted on. So on the RICO and the two big charges he was acquitted on, they can't bring that in. They can try to bring in other bad acts, but that's a huge benefit to Mr. Combs.
Bill, after the judge denied bail, the defense said that the defendant, Sean Diddy Combs, wanted to speak to the judge. Is that something you've seen before?
All the time, and the defense lawyer made the right decision. This defense, and it really was less is more. No witnesses. The government didn't prove its case. This defense has been hugely successful all along, and having Mr. Combs address the judge at this point would be insanity. So I think that was a prudent move. You can certainly understand Mr. Combs' frustration, but it's not his job to address the court. That's what his lawyer does.
All right, thanks to both of you. We're continuing to follow the breaking news out of New York. A judge denying bail today for Sean Diddy Combs. And we are back with our breaking news. The judge in the Sean Diddy Combs trial has just rather shockingly denied him bail. This, of course, coming after the news that the jury convicted him of 2 of the lesser charges in the government's case against him, finding him not guilty of the 3 biggest and most consequential charges. Do we have Elizabeth Wagmeister yet? Okay, so let's get straight to CNN's Elizabeth Wagmeister, who's outside the court, along with Laura Coates. Laura, this is a surprising development. What are we learning? What are the judge's reasons for not letting him out?
Well, we are still learning all the reasons why the judge has denied bail to Sean Diddy Combs pending his sentencing. That can be an indication of a number of things. Remember, the prosecution is intending to ask for jail time in this matter. Each of those charges could provide 10 years in prison. The sentencing guidelines will obviously dictate to what extent that will be followed. Those are the maximum. It is the ceiling, not the floor. But given the number of offenses he has failed to have in the past and the corresponding ways in which you judge someone's category that they're in for the ultimate decision of sentencing, it could be far less than that. I will say, of course, that the judge, by making this statement, essentially is giving a bit of a heads up that perhaps jail time is in fact what he will actually hand down to Sean Diddy Combs when the sentencing does in fact occur. I will also say that this indicates that the judge believed that there were no conditions of release that could have been met that would have satisfied the court in terms of whatever pending threat there may have been to the society or the witnesses or victims in this case that as alleged, and that the conditions of release, including a passport being removed, no access to a flight, living in places other than New York, all these things could have been a part of it. You have additional information as well in terms of the why.
You know, we don't have the why quite yet. We are waiting from our team inside the courtroom, but when you said that part of the reason why could be that the judge perhaps believes that Combs could be a threat to society or the other witnesses, it reminded me of a letter that Cassie Ventura's attorney submitted just hours ago opposing him being released on bail. Jake, I want to read you a quote from his letter. It says, quote, Ms. Ventura believes that Mr. Combs is likely to pose a danger to the victims who testified in this case, including herself, as well as to the community. Now, before this trial began, Laura, we remember that there were 3 attempts at bail from Combs's defense, all of which were denied by 3 different judges, one of them being the judge who is overseeing this case. Now, part of the reasons why the prosecution had alleged that he was tampering with witnesses, that he was trying to manipulate witnesses from behind bars, the prosecution had said at one point that Sean Combs was paying inmates at the MDC to use their phones in jail. So that was one of the reasons why the judge denied bail before the trial, as he was awaiting this trial. But again, we don't know the reasons yet.
A perfect segue here, Jake, as well, because we're learning that the judge says this on the bench, essentially that he had denied bail when it wasn't mandatory before the trial, and, quote, sees no reason to reach the opposite conclusion now. He's also quoting the defense at different instances when Combs' own lawyers acknowledged his violence towards his former girlfriends during the trial, saying at trial the defense conceded defendants' violence in personal relationships, saying It happened in relation to Cassie Ventura and Jane. This is very important because remember, one of the things that was said in the opening statement by Tenny Garagos is that they own the violence, that they admitted to what was seen in that now infamous exclusive video obtained by CNN for the Intercontinental Hotel, where there was a savage assault against Cassie Ventura. And of course, the defense, the prosecution during trial said, well, domestic violence is not a defense of sex trafficking. Well, he wasn't convicted on that, but you can better believe that the notice from Cassie's attorney and others probably weighed very heavily on this judge's mind.
And Elizabeth, you spoke with Cassie's attorney. We're going to bring some of that interview later in the show. But it has to be pretty difficult for someone like Cassie, who came forward to tell her story, to tell it in such a graphic and revealing and vulnerable way, and then have a jury of her peers basically say, we don't believe you beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes, Jake, so I know that we are going to get more of this interview a bit later in the show, but I will tell you that her attorney, Douglas Wigdor, did tell me that he believes that the jury actually did believe Cassie and did believe her core allegations, just that the burden is very high for these federal crimes, and that he believes that the jury ultimately did not see a way to meet this charge because, again, that the jury did not believe that the prosecutors met their burden of proof, but that he does believe that Cassie was believed. He also said that Cassie is very proud of herself. This was traumatic for her to testify, but it was also cathartic. She can now move on. We know that she is a mother of 3, a newborn at home. She was 8 months pregnant, testifying in this trial, had her 3rd child shortly after she got off the stand. So she's really focused on family. Her attorney told me that she has a great support system, not just her family, but also she is in therapy. She has great resources now, and he said, you never heal from this. It'll take a lifetime to heal, but she's well into that process. So it sounds like she is doing okay. Her attorney actually told me, don't worry about Cassie.
All right, we're going to squeeze in another quick break. We're going to come back in a second. Much more in the breaking news. A judge denying bail for Sean Diddy Combs after he was acquitted of 3 charges, convicted of 2 lesser charges. We'll be right back.